This is the view from the top of Mount Ainslie in Canberra, Australia's national capital, on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people, the Ngambri people and the Ngarigu people. Looking down from Mount Ainslie, we can see one of the world's great avenues. On the distant hillside across Lake Burley-Griffin, we can see Australia's Parliament House, one of the largest buildings in the Southern Hemisphere. A kilometre around the base and integrated into the hill itself. In front of it stands Australia's old Parliament House, which now houses the National Portrait Gallery and the Museum of Australian Democracy. In front of it, the site of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. Between them and the lake stands Reconciliation Place, a symbolic and visual reminder that our whole nation stands on lands to which Aboriginal people belong. And then on this side of the lake, up Anzac Avenue, a direct line from the front door of Parliament House travels through the front door of the Australian War Memorial, past the names of all the fallen, and into the Anzac Chapel. So symbolically, Aboriginal people look up the hill and say, "We have cared for this land for thousands of years. You in Parliament must care for it now." And symbolically, the names of the fallen look down the avenue and say, "We fell to earn and preserve the freedoms expressed in Parliament. Be worthy of us." G'day everyone, my name is Anthony Marinac and welcome to Module 2 of our Introduction to Law. This second module is all about the Parliament and all about statute law. You see, that building built into the hill in Canberra is the engine room of Australian law. The overwhelming bulk of our contemporary law is statute law, which means law passed by the Parliament, or law made by public servants who are following the directions of the Parliament. Together with the state parliaments, they produce the vast bulk of the law that you will be studying in this course and in future courses. If you want to know about the law, then it's important that you understand that the law doesn't just materialise from somewhere. Law is made. It's made by people. And the factory in which the law is made is the Parliament. In this first video, our focus will be on learning about the Parliament as an institution. Where does it fit in with the Constitution? How's it formed? Where does politics fit in? And what are the laws that actually bind the Parliament? We spoke in the first module about the rule of law and about how nobody is above the law. So laws have to bind the Parliament and protect us from tyranny. What are those laws? In the second video in this module, we will look in some detail at the legislative process. In other words, when the Parliament is making law, how does this work? If Parliament is a legislation factory, well, what's the machinery inside that factory? And how does that operate? In the third video, we'll talk about how to research legislation and how to read legislation effectively. Because if you know the tricks, legislation is actually quite logical, usually quite comprehensible, and chock full of clues and supporting information hidden right there in plain sight. In the fourth and final video, we'll explore the art and science of statutory interpretation, because there are rules and guidelines in place which will help you to know exactly how to properly read a piece of legislation. We've got a lot to get through, so let's get cracking. Before we get to the Parliament itself, there's something else you'll need to understand. They call it the Doctrine of the Separation of Powers. Most people associate the idea with a Frenchman named Montesquieu, but the doctrine's actually a bit older than that. The idea is that any system of power can be divided into three functions: the function of making rules, the function of carrying those rules out, and the function of adjudicating or resolving disputes about those rules. In technical terms, these are the legislative estate of power, the executive estate, and the judicial estate. So the Parliament makes the laws, the public service carries those laws into effect, and the court adjudicates disputes. Now, the doctrine of the separation of powers says that freedom and liberty come from having those three estates of power kept separate. So if you're a member of the legislature, you should only be a member of the legislature. If you're a member of the executive, you should only be a member of the executive. And if you're a member of the judiciary, well, you should only be a member of the judiciary. If any person gets their hands on two, or heaven forbid, all three of the estates of power, well, then you end up with tyranny. Now, this makes sense. Imagine if someone controlled both the executive and the judiciary. Well, the government could do horrible things to you, and if you tried to sue them, well, they'd also control the courts. So your chances wouldn't be too good. It would go directly against the very basic idea of rule of law that we've been discussing since the first video of the first module. The United States of America has a system which is pretty close to full separation of powers. That's why the US President is elected separately from the Congress. The President doesn't have a seat in the Congress. The President can't even address the Congress without an invitation. Why? Because the President is the leader of the executive government, and the Congress is the legislature. Similarly, the judges of the Supreme Court are completely independent in the United States of America. They are nominated by the President, but then they have to be confirmed by the United States Senate. So neither the executive nor the legislature can go and appoint judges on their own. By keeping those three estates of power separate, the Constitution of the United States hopes to avoid tyranny. I want you to keep this idea, separation of powers, in mind as you watch the rest of this video. Think about the parliamentary system that I'm going to describe to you, and see if you feel like that system involves the separation of powers. We've already run into the idea of Parliament in our first module. You might remember that we talked about the Witangmort of Anglo-Saxon times, where the folk moot sent representatives to the shire moot, and the shire moot sent representatives to the national Witangmort. You might also remember that when William the Conqueror invaded and took control of England, he preserved those ideas and only changed things gradually. We also talked about the Magna Carta. Well, one of the provisions of the Magna Carta essentially said that the king could no longer just demand money. He had to ask an assembly of the barons for that money. So this early idea of a parliament didn't really have anything to do with passing laws. The early parliaments were more of a financial watchdog to try and keep some tabs on the spending of the king. Remember then we talked about the English Civil War, and I said that war started as a battle between the Parliament and the king. Well, what happened was that the king was frustrated by the Parliament's refusal to give him enough money. He actually invaded the Parliament and tried to arrest members. And then he dismissed the whole Parliament and tried to raise money in other ways. All this strife set the scene for the Glorious Revolution, when the Parliament invited William and Mary of Orange to take the crown. And the Parliament established rules in the Bill of Rights 1688, which would bind the king. Through all these centuries, the Parliament, which sat quite rarely and was basically made up of nobles and bishops, was still all about the money, controlling taxes and controlling spending. Somewhere along the way, though, around about the reign of King Henry VIII, that's the one with all the wives, people started to send petitions to the Parliament. Now, a petition was a request, either signed by one person or by many people, asking the nobles in Parliament to do something. Someone might petition to be granted a divorce, or they might petition to be allowed to clear a certain forest and plant crops. Or they might petition the Parliament to make a new road between two cities. And the Parliament, which was composed of all the nobles after all, the Parliament started to answer these petitions. And they started to make rules in response to these petitions. And once the Parliament was making rules and doing real things on the ground, well, the Parliament starts to look very much like a government, doesn't it? That rule-making function continued and grew. And by the time of the Bill of Rights in 1688, there were several provisions which quite explicitly gave Parliament the right to hear petitions and to make and amend laws, and provisions which took away the Crown's authority to just strike down those laws. So the Parliament had moved from being a budgetary institution to being a law-making institution. Now, you might remember we talked about the Reform period in the 19th century. That was important because prior to the Reform period, most people in England couldn't vote. You had to meet a property qualification, which meant that only really the rich could vote. The vote was progressively extended until by the end of the Reform era, almost all men in England over 21 could vote. This meant that for the first time, the Parliament represented all social classes. Eventually, women obtained the vote too, and Parliament was properly democratic. When the Australian colonies became self-governing, they were all given parliamentary institutions too, modelled very much along the lines of the English Parliament. Right down to the point where our House of Representatives is decorated in green, just like the House of Commons, and our Senate is decorated in red, just like the House of Lords. So let's talk about our Parliament. The first chapter of the Australian Constitution sets out the rules for the Australian Parliament. That chapter is long. Nearly half of our whole Constitution is set aside for the rules on how the Parliament is formed and how the Parliament acts. Now, in Australia, we have what is called a Bicameral Parliament. That means that the Australian Parliament has two houses. We call those the House of Representatives and the Senate. In formal terms, the Australian Parliament actually has three elements: the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the Queen, whose powers in Australia are generally delegated to the Governor-General. Having said that, the Governor-General's powers in relation to the Parliament are pretty limited. From a practical perspective, the Governor-General is the one who dissolves the Parliament when a new election is required, and then the Governor-General summons the Parliament to meet again after an election has been held. Now, those sound like strong powers, right? But we have an important convention in Australia which says that the Governor-General only calls elections when the Prime Minister advises that an election should be held. This convention has only ever been ignored once, in 1975, when Governor-General Sir John Kerr dismissed the Labor government of Gough Whitlam and called new elections, despite Prime Minister Whitlam's advice that he should not do so. Now, the story of the dismissal is far too complicated for this lecture. What I really want you to understand is that the Parliament is dissolved for elections and called again afterwards by the Governor-General on the advice of the Prime Minister. Okay, so there are two houses. The House of Representatives is known as the lower house, and sometimes called the People's House. The House of Representatives contains 150 members. Basically, the whole of Australia is divided up into 150 more or less equal portions. Those are called electorates, and they each contain roughly 100,000 voters. Each electorate sends one representative to the House of Representatives. Now, if you think about it, that means that the states with the most people, or the most voters anyway, will have the most members in the House of Representatives. So New South Wales, our most populous state, has around 50 members in the House of Representatives. Tasmania, our least populous state, has just 5. And in fact, the only reason that it has 5 is that the Constitution says every state gets at least 5. So a full third of our House of Representatives comes from New South Wales. Meetings of the House of Representatives are chaired by the Speaker, whose role is to maintain order and keep the House running. The Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, who both almost always sit in the House of Representatives, sit opposite one another at the main table of the House. The House of Representatives has one particularly special role in our political system. It is the House where government is formed. You see, the way you become Prime Minister in Australia, it's not through direct election like they have in the United States. No normal citizen ever gets to vote for Prime Minister. Instead, the Prime Minister is the person who has the support of a majority of members of the House of Representatives. In effect, it's the leader of whichever political party has a majority or can establish a majority in the House of Representatives. Now, the Senate is known as the upper house of Parliament. The Senate is a bit different to the House of Reps. For starters, it's only half the size. The Constitution says it must be as near as practical to half the size. There are 76 senators, 12 from each state and 2 from each of the Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory. So New South Wales, with its very large population, has the same number of senators as Tasmania, with its very small population. The idea of this, as we mentioned in the first module, was to give the small states some protection against the larger states. Another difference in the Senate is that each senator represents their whole state. So senators are elected by a system based on proportional representation. If a party gets roughly half the votes in the state, then ideally they should end up with roughly half the senators. The only difference in the powers between the Senate and the House of Representatives is that government is formed in the House of Reps. If you set that aside, both houses have exactly the same authority. Legislation needs to be passed through both houses in order to become law. Legislation can start in either house, and there are ministers in each house. We'll talk about ministers shortly. Basically, the two houses are completely equal in power, but formed on the basis of different voting patterns. So let's talk about those votes. Members of the House of Representatives are elected for a maximum of 3 years. Now, that doesn't mean they're guaranteed 3 years, because the Prime Minister can ask for an election pretty much whenever they like. But the expectation is that there will usually be 3 years between elections. Elections in Australia are run by the Australian Electoral Commission, which is a government body, but it operates independently so that everyone can be confident that elections are fair and free. Elections in Australia are compulsory. Every adult has to be on the electoral roll, and everyone on the electoral roll has to attend a polling place and cast their vote. Most polling places are schools, And they usually feature sausage sizzles where voters can have what is known as a democracy sausage. A democracy sausage is not compulsory, but it bloody ought to be. When they cast a vote in the House of Representatives, voters cast what is called a preferential vote. In other words, if there are 5 candidates, the voter has to put the number 1 beside their favourite candidate, the number 2 beside their next favourite, and so on until they reach number 5. What happens then is that all the votes are counted. And if one candidate gets more than half of the total votes, then it's over, and that person gets elected. If nobody gets more than half the votes, well, then they take the candidate who received the least number of votes and they knock them out of the running. Then they take all those votes and they redistribute them according to the voters' second preferences. They keep doing that until one of the candidates has more than half the votes, and that's when the winner is declared. Now, senators are a bit different. For one thing, senators are elected for 6 years, not 3. The way this works is that for most elections, they split the Senate in half. So every 3 years, we elect half of the senators, and then 3 years later, we elect the other half. Another difference with the senators is that they don't have to earn half the votes. If you think about it, it's easy to see why. If there are 6 senators being elected at each election, well, there's just about no chance of anyone getting 50%. Instead, to be elected, senators need to obtain a quota of votes, which normally means roughly 14% of the votes. This has a massive impact on the shape of the Senate. I mean, let's think about it. A minor party, like say the Australian Greens or One Nation, is going to struggle to find a single community or a single electorate where they will receive 50% support even after preferences. It'll happen sometimes, but they're going to struggle. It's more likely that their supporters will be spread throughout the state and not concentrated sufficiently in one little area. That makes it almost impossible for those minor parties to win seats in the House of Representatives. But for Senate elections, it doesn't matter how spread out their support is. They only need 14% from anywhere in the state. A minor party, therefore, has a much stronger chance of having senators elected. And that's exactly what has happened. From the Australian Democrats in the late 1970s and then the Nuclear Disarmament Party in the 1980s, through to the Australian Greens, Family First, One Nation, the Liberal Democrats, Palmer United, the Motoring Enthusiasts Party, the Nick Xenophon team, and a handful of independents such as Brian Harradine, Darren Hinch and Jackie Lambie. They've all been elected far more readily than would ever have been possible in the House of Representatives. This in turn means that the government has seldom held a majority in the Senate. Since the 1980 election, there has only ever been one brief period, from 2004 until 2007, where the government has had a majority in the Senate. The House of Representatives, on the other hand, has been almost entirely dominated by the government. In the Senate, if the government wants to get its legislation through, it has to negotiate. It has to be open to changes. It has to be open to discussions. If it's not, well, then its legislation simply won't get through. Now, there are arguments for and against the value of a Senate that works this way. On the one hand, you could say there's something terrific about having a parliament that is not a rubber stamp, where the debates actually mean something and nobody holds absolute power. On the other hand, there's an argument that it's really quite unfair that the votes of a relatively small number of people electing minor party senators can end up having heaps of authority because they hold the crucial few extra votes needed to form a majority in the Senate. Both of those arguments have some validity, but for my money, I love the fact that negotiation and compromise are somewhere part of our political process. Now, the description of the Parliament that I gave a few moments ago, where senators represent their states and members of the House of Reps represent their local communities, well, that description is true. I'm sure that all senators seek to represent their states, and I'm sure that all members of the House of Representatives seek to represent their constituents. But almost all of those senators and members come from political parties. Political parties are not even a formal part of our parliamentary process. They weren't even mentioned in the Constitution until 1977, and even then, it's only in passing. Despite this, the political parties are without doubt the dominant feature of Australian parliamentary politics. Parliament is not really the place where all of those representatives come together to represent their state or their district. Parliament is where political parties come to do battle. Elections are not really contests between individual candidates. They're contests between political parties. The Prime Minister is not just the person who has the most support in the House. They're the leader of a political party, the political party which has the most members in the House. I mean, if I was to talk to you about Parliament and not talk about political parties, well, really, I'd only be telling half the story, wouldn't I? The major political parties in Australia are, first, the Australian Labor Party. The Australian Labor Party, or ALP, began in the 1890s as the political wing of the trade union movement. And there are still very strong links between Labor and the trade unions. Next, the Liberal Party of Australia, which was formed in 1949 from an earlier party called the United Australia Party, and from earlier parties even before that. What those parties had in common was the idea that they first and foremost opposed the Labor Party, and second, that they opposed any idea that they considered to be associated with socialism or communism. Because of their opposition to Labor, the Liberal Party is often associated with the interests of business people. However, it's fair to say that the Liberal Party tends to be more conservative in its orientation, while the Labor Party considers itself to be more progressive. Third, we have the National Party of Australia, now known as the Nationals. They were once known as the Country Party of Australia, which gives you a much better clue about their interests and their orientation. The Nationals are very much about country people and rural interests. The Nationals and the Liberal Party have a long history of working together, often in formal coalitions. And in some states like Queensland and the Northern Territory, they've actually combined to form the Liberal National Party in Queensland and the Country Liberal Party in the Northern Territory. So those are the major parties. There have been a range of minor parties in Australian politics, but the most prominent of those still going around is the Australian Greens, whose focus is on environmentalism, but who also consider themselves socially progressive. They've been strong for many years in Tasmania, but they now have senators from a number of states. So how do political parties really change things in the Parliament? Well, the biggest impact they have is through party discipline. In Australia, party discipline is just about ironclad. Once the party has made a decision, its members are expected to vote as they're told to vote, and they're expected to make public statements in support of their party position, regardless of their personal position, and even regardless of the views of the people who elected them. In the Labor Party, Labor members even sign a pledge that they will do this. In both parties, if a member was to cross the floor and vote with the other side, well, this would be a significant media event, and it would almost certainly end the career of that politician. It doesn't even matter what the vote is, whether they're voting on the biggest and most important legislation or whether they're voting on when the House should take lunch. They're expected to toe the party line. Now, it doesn't need to be that way. In the United Kingdom and in the United States of America, members cross the floor all the time. The sky doesn't seem to fall in, and it happens often enough that the media aren't even really interested. One argument, though, is that this is okay because most voters are voting for the party, not the individual. And so the voters expect that the members of Parliament will follow the lead of their party. The voters haven't elected them to make their own decisions about things. Those who make this argument say that party discipline leads to stability. A government which knows it will win every vote in the chamber can get on with governing instead of constantly managing an ever-changing headcount. Well, what do you think? Would you like a more freewheeling democracy? Or are you convinced of the importance of stability? Are parties too powerful, or have they merely created order out of chaos? Well, I don't know the right answer. If you work it out, please let me know. All right, now I want to come back to a question I left you with earlier when I mentioned the doctrine of the separation of powers. How well do you think Australia rates according to that doctrine? If you answered not very well, then you get a gold star. I mean, think about it. Every public service department is headed up by a minister. Those ministers all sit in the cabinet. They also all have seats in the Parliament. In fact, under the Constitution, you have to have a seat in Parliament in order to remain a minister. So each minister is in charge of a branch of the executive government, but they also sit in the cabinet, which has huge influence over the business of the Parliament. Gets even worse when you consider that the Prime Minister, who's the head of the entire executive government, is also the leader of the political party which has the most seats in Parliament. This is just the sort of thing Montesquieu warned us against. And yet, somehow, we don't seem to have a tyrannical government in Australia. Sometimes we've had governments which were foolish or incompetent, short-sighted, intolerant. But never yet have we had a government which was downright tyrannical. Why not? If we get the separation of powers so wrong. The answer lies in another doctrine called the Doctrine of Responsible Government. This is an idea that started in the United Kingdom and was imported into Australia. Basically, it's pretty simple and it has nothing to do with the government being responsible in the sense of being careful and sensible. We've already talked about the fact that the Prime Minister becomes Prime Minister by getting the support of a majority of members of the House of Representatives. Now, if the Prime Minister loses the support of the House of Representatives at any time, well, then they must resign as Prime Minister. Now, as of the time of this recording, that most recently happened in September 2015, when Prime Minister Tony Abbott lost the support of his own party, the Liberal Party. The result of losing support from the party meant that Mr Abbott no longer had the support of a majority in the Parliament. And as a result, he resigned, and Australia's current Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, got the gig. See how it works? The Prime Minister gets his or her position from the Parliament's support. So the Prime Minister is responsible to the government, hence responsible government. This notion of responsible government has two key implications. First, it means that unlike, say, the President of the United States, a Prime Minister in a system of responsible government can never be certain whether they will still be the Prime Minister this time next week, or indeed this afternoon. Just winning an election does not guarantee a Prime Minister that they will stay in office. Ideally, this is a great incentive for the Prime Minister to do a good job. If they start to do a poor job, well, then their own colleagues in their political party will watch the opinion polls and start scheming against them. Second, and more importantly, there are a number of parliamentary processes which have nothing to do with passing legislation. Instead, these processes are all about providing ways for the Parliament to hold the government to account, to make the government respond, so that the government is responsible. The most obvious of these is question time. An hour is set aside every sitting day in each chamber, and during that hour, members of Parliament who are not ministers get to ask questions. They ask those questions of the members of Parliament who are ministers. Often those questions are purely political and intended to make the government look bad. Sometimes they're more honest and reasonable, where a member asks about something specifically important to their constituents. And very often indeed the questions are what we call Dorothy Dix questions, where the minister's own party basically serves them a nice soft question and gives them an excuse to carry on about how wonderful they are. The most effective of the responsible government processes is called Senate estimates. Estimates takes place 3 times a year, and it's part of the Parliament's budget process. During estimates, not only the minister, but also many hundreds of senior public servants must appear before a panel of senators, including both opposition and minor party senators. These hearings are gruelling and often go for 13 or 14 hours a day. The senators can, and they do, dig right down into the details of government programs, trying to identify what's working and what's not. Why does the government put up with this scrutiny? Why does it bring the public servants to face the senators? Because the government must respond to the Parliament. Responsible government. Responsible government gives rise to the third doctrine that you'll need to understand in order to make sense of the Parliament. This one's a double-barrelled one called the doctrines of individual ministerial responsibility and collective cabinet responsibility. The doctrine of individual ministerial responsibility basically says that since the minister is the only person in the Parliament who's responsible for a particular area of government, well then if there's a major stuff-up in that area of policy, the minister should resign. Now I've got to tell you, this rule is not followed all that often. Ministers and their departments sometimes stuff things up awfully, and their instinct is to spin like crazy, lie if necessary, and avoid resigning at all costs. However, if you watch the political media, you'll see the opposition quite often calling for a particular minister to resign, making their case in both the Parliament and the media. This might not result in the minister resigning, but it may result in the public forming the view that the government is underperforming. And if the minister embarrasses the Prime Minister badly enough, well then the minister may in fact be forced to resign. Not as a matter of honour or responsibility, but as a matter of political necessity. Collective cabinet responsibility is a bit different. You see, cabinet meetings are secret. Sometimes things leak to the press, but the idea is that those meetings are meant to be secret and that the minutes are not meant to be released for 30 years. What this means is that in cabinet, ministers can speak freely. They can oppose government policy. They can go their hardest to prevent a particular decision being made or prevent a particular piece of legislation from proceeding. But once the vote is taken and the decision is made, the whole cabinet is bound to support it. So that same minister, having argued ferociously against the new legislation in cabinet, well, they're then required to go into the Parliament and ferociously support that legislation because they're part of the cabinet and that's what cabinet decided. Collective cabinet responsibility also means that if the Prime Minister loses the numbers in the House of Representatives, the whole ministry must resign, not just the Prime Minister. Okay, so what happens then if a minister feels so strongly about an issue that they just no longer feel they can support the decision of cabinet on that point? Well, they have only one option, and that's to resign from the cabinet and resign their position as a minister. That'll mean that they'll return to the backbenches of Parliament as a normal member or normal senator. It doesn't happen too often that people resign on grounds of personal commitment like that. But every now and then it does. The doctrines of individual and collective ministerial responsibility means that the ministry does face the Parliament, and they face the processes of responsible government. But they face these processes as a team. This enhances the strength of the party system in our parliamentary system. Now, there's one last thing to say before we end this video. I've spoken in this video about the Commonwealth Parliament. So what about the state parliaments? Well, each state parliament is subtly different, and this would become a very long video indeed if I tried to go through all of them. However, the parliaments also share a great many of their processes. And if you understand the Commonwealth Parliament, then you'll understand enough about each state parliament to get you by, at least at the start. So that brings us to the end of this first video in the second module. Gosh, we've covered a lot of ground. Separation of powers, constitution, legislative powers, electoral processes, political parties. The one thing we really haven't discussed is the obvious. How do these parliaments actually make laws? I mean, that's what they're really there for, right? Well, all that and more will be revealed, folks, in the next video. Stay tuned.